Endless night. Peppa woke up in the middle of the night. She immediately felt that something was wrong. Usually, even at night, her room wasn't completely dark. Street lights outside, the soft glow of the moon, the faint light from her night lamp. But now she was surrounded by absolute darkness. She blinked, trying to adjust to it. But nothing changed. The darkness was thick, like heavy smoke, like a black veil that had covered the entire house. Peppa slowly sat up in bed. A strange unease tightened in her chest. She reached out, found her night lamp, and flicked the switch. The light did not turn on. Peppa frowned. She swung her legs off the bed. The floor was cold, colder than usual. She walked to the window and cautiously pulled back the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside was endless, bottomless darkness. No moon, no stars, no distant glows from the neighbors' houses. Only black emptiness. Peppa pressed her face against the glass, straining her eyes to see anything. But the longer she looked, the more it seemed like the dark mass outside was moving. Like it was alive. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned and ran out of her room. The house was silent. Too silent. She called for Mummy Pig, for Daddy Pig, for George. No answer. The door to her parents' bedroom was slightly open. Peppa froze in the hallway. She didn't want to go inside, but she had to. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed the door open. The beds were empty. The blankets were neatly tucked in, as if they had never been used. Peppa took a step back. This was not her house. It couldn't be. She ran downstairs to the front door. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Locked. She rushed to the living room window and pressed her face to the glass. The town was motionless. The streets were swallowed in thick blackness. The houses stood as silent shadows. Usually there would be lights in the windows, but now not a single house was glowing. Not a single sound. No footsteps, no distant hum of cars, no rustling wind. Only silence. Peppa stepped outside. The cold air pricked her skin. She walked down the road, glancing around. No one. She reached the town square where her friends usually played. But where the town should have been, there was now a vast, endless void. The ground abruptly ended, like the town had been erased, leaving only this black abyss behind. Peppa stepped back, her heart pounding. And then, in the silence, a sound echoed. A slow, heavy footstep. Peppa turned around. A figure stood in the middle of the empty street, tall, motionless, faceless, blending into the darkness. The figure did not move, but Peppa felt its gaze on her. She took a step back. The figure came closer. It didn't walk. It just was suddenly nearer. A deep fear settled in her chest. She turned and ran. But with every step, the road beneath her feet disappeared. The houses melted into the void. The town was vanishing, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She fell to her knees, looking around frantically. Nothing. Only emptiness. And then, breathing. Software. Cold. Right behind her. A whisper. Someone said her name. She spun around. The darkness collapsed. And then, nothing. The next morning, the town was gone. Not a single soul remained. Only endless night, and someone standing at its center. Someone who remembered how things used to be. But now, everything belonged to the darkness. Peppa Pig, the others. The evening sky was pale gray. The air was completely still. The pig family was having dinner in silence. The clinking of cutlery, the slow footsteps, the dripping of the tap. Everything sounded louder than usual. After dinner, Mummy Pig washed the dishes. Daddy Pig sat in his chair with the newspaper. George played with his dinosaur near the sofa. Peppa was putting together a puzzle on the floor. The evening felt like it was lasting slightly longer than it should. There was a knock at the door. Once, then again, no doorbell, no voices. Daddy Pig opened it. Standing on the doorstep were them, exact copies of the family, one to one. Mummy, Daddy, Peppa, George. Same clothes, same faces, same posture. Something was wrong. Their poses were too still, their expressions too flat. Eyes just slightly too dark. Smiles frozen. They didn't speak. They simply stepped inside. No one stopped them. They spread out through the house. The second mummy stood at the sink. The second Daddy beside the chair. The second Peppa sat opposite the real one, moving a puzzle piece slowly back and forth, never placing it. The second George just stood there, glassy-eyed. At first, the real family just watched, as if it were all a mistake. But the copies didn't leave. They stayed, and acted as though they had always lived here. The next morning, it all happened again. Two families under one roof. One breakfast, mirrored movements. But the copies were off, just slightly wrong, always half a second behind, as if mimicking, learning. The second Daddy sat in the chair but never turned a page. The second mummy washed already clean dishes. The second George held the dinosaur upside down and never blinked. The second Peppa stared directly at the real Peppa, unmoving, without emotion. Real Peppa tried to interact, but the other Peppa didn't speak. She only mirrored her like a reflection, a delayed, hollow one. By the third day, the real family began to fade, literally. Their colors dulled, their movements slowed, their voices grew quiet. The mirrors showed only the new family. On the fourth day, the real George was gone. No one looked for him. The second George remained, walking silently through the house, smiling emptily. Peppa realized no one noticed them disappearing. Real Daddy and Mummy were pale, tired, fading like old photographs. The copies now moved with more energy, more clarity. They no longer imitated. They simply existed. On the fifth day, the real Mummy vanished. Only Peppa remained. Still bright, still real. She tried to leave. The front door was there, but nothing was behind it. Only solid white light. No road, no sky, no sound. The other Peppa now slept in her bed, wore her clothes, held her toys. The dinosaur rested in the hands of the new George. One night, real Peppa woke to find the other Peppa watching her from beneath the bed, still, unblinking. After that, there was silence. The new family lived in the house. They laughed, cooked, played. They looked normal, as if they had always been there. But in the cupboard beneath the stairs, behind old boxes and bags, if you look closely, you might see a pale pink shape, sitting quietly, knees to chest. No face, no eyes, no name. It doesn't move anymore. This episode of Peppa Pig was never shown on TV and is a deleted episode of the animated series The Black Hole Night had fallen over Peppa Pig's town. The air was fresh, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and the windows of houses shimmered with warm, inviting light. In the distance, the cheerful laughter of children echoed from an evening walk, blending with the low hum of cars returning home. Everything seemed normal. But then, the sky changed. At first, it was just a slight distortion in the air, barely visible. Then the stars began to flicker, as if their light was struggling to shine through an unseen veil. Slowly, silence spread over the town. Not the usual peaceful silence of the night, but something else, something unnatural, as if someone had muted the entire world. And then, in the middle of the sky, a black dot appeared. Small, almost unnoticeable, it began to grow. It looked as if space itself was folding inward, twisting, vanishing. The larger it became, the louder the low, rumbling hum in the air grew, like a distant thunderclap frozen in time. The first gusts of wind struck the streets. Light objects trembled, then lifted off the ground and floated upwards. Trash cans tipped over, leaves spiraled into the air, and cracks began to form on the pavement. But no one moved. The townspeople stepped out onto the streets, gazing upward. Their faces weren't filled with fear, just confusion. This was something unknown, something that should not exist in their world. And then it began. The black hole devoured the first sound, the scream of a frightened squirrel who tried to run but whose voice was swallowed instantly. It was as if the air itself no longer carried sound. And then something lifted off the ground. Mr. Bull had stood too close. He felt his hooves lose contact with the earth, an unseen force pulling him upward. His eyes widened in panic, his legs flailed helplessly. Another second, and he vanished into the consuming darkness. Panic erupted. Animals ran in all directions, but it was already too late. The black hole's power was increasing. Gravel from the roads lifted into the air. Trees were ripped from their roots. Cars slid from their parking spots and hovered as if obeying some new, unnatural force. The sky turned black. Not the darkness of night, but a living, endless void that slowly, inevitably consumed the world. Peppa's family hid inside their home. The windows rattled, the walls groaned, as if the house itself was resisting the pull. The wind outside howled, transforming into the endless scream of nature itself. Dishes in the cupboards clinked together, doors slammed, lights flickered on and off. Peppa and George clung to their parents. They didn't cry. It was too terrifying to cry. Outside, the streets were empty. The town was disappearing. The shadows stretched longer and longer until they merged into a single, endless mass. The house trembled and began to rise, lifting from the ground. No more voices could be heard, only the slow, relentless hum, and the black void taking everything. Peppa Pig, lost episode, the new one. One morning, Peppa woke up, and there was someone else in the room. He was sitting on the bed beside George, about their age. His skin was pale, almost gray. He didn't move or speak, but when Peppa stood up, he looked at her and smiled, as if he had been waiting. Everything else was ordinary: the bright morning light, the familiar bedroom, the smell of breakfast. Except this new child, unknown, uninvited, behaved as though he had always lived there. In the kitchen, 3 bowls were already set on the table. Mummy Pig served breakfast without a hint of confusion. Daddy Pig flipped through his newspaper. George laughed and ate his porridge. Everyone carried on as if nothing had changed. The new child ate with them. Throughout the day, Peppa watched. He helped set the table. He played with George. He sat with Daddy Pig. He drew pictures. His name was Ralphie. Everyone said it so casually, so naturally, as if he had always been part of the family. But Peppa didn't remember him. Not from yesterday, not from last week, not from ever. She checked the family photo albums. Ralphie was in all of them, standing beside George, holding hands, sitting on Daddy Pig's lap. Where Peppa used to be, now he was, as if she had been carefully cut out and replaced. On the second day, the bedroom changed. Peppa's bed was pushed into the corner. Her things began to vanish. Clothes, toys, even her books. In their place were new objects, gray, unfamiliar, lifeless, no scent, no name, no memory. The family talked to each other, smiled, lived their lives, but none of them looked at Peppa. Sometimes their gaze passed near her, but never directly. She tried to make herself known, with movement, with noise, with presence, but was met only with silence, or worse, polite indifference. Only Ralphie looked directly at her, for long moments, without blinking. He never blinked, and his smile, always the same, whether he was eating, playing, or simply sitting still. He knew. By the third day, her name was never spoken. No one called her for meals. No one asked where she was. George laughed only with Ralphie. Mummy Pig stroked his head when he passed. Daddy Pig read bedtime stories to 2 children. On the 4th morning, Peppa's bed was gone. The room now had only two beds, George's and Ralphie's. Her belongings had disappeared completely. There were no traces. The only photo on the wall showed four figures: Ralphie, George, Mummy Pig, and Daddy Pig. The caption beneath it read, "Our family." The mirror reflected the empty room. Ralphie and George played on the floor. Peppa stood in the doorway, but her reflection wasn't there. The house looked the same, but inside it, another story had begun. One where Peppa had never existed. That night, she simply faded. No sound, no trace, no goodbye. The next morning, someone carefully closed her old sketchbook. On the last page was a drawing. Two children, a mother and a father. Four simple shapes, no names, no Peppa. Peppa Pig, the door to darkness. The day was gloomy and quiet. The wind rustled the trees outside, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Peppa and George were playing in their room, building a tall tower out of blocks. The house felt especially cozy until it started to get dark. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up and accidentally knocked over the tower, sending the blocks tumbling to the floor. George whined in frustration, but Peppa wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring at the corner of the room. There, where there had always been just a wall, now stood a door that had never been there before. It was tall, old, with a black handle. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong in their house. Maybe Mummy and Daddy built a new storage closet, Peppa thought. But the idea sent a strange chill down her spine. George, forgetting about the fallen tower, also noticed the door and pressed himself against Peppa. Peppa took a step forward. The door was closed, but a cold draft seeped from the gap beneath it. She slowly reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing. And then the door creaked open slightly. Just a tiny bit, but it was enough. From the darkness inside came a soft rustling sound. Peppa and George froze, listening. No light, no voices. Just a faint scratching noise, like something in the shadows was dragging its claws across the floor. Peppa quickly pulled her hoof away. George gripped her dress tightly. And then the door started opening wider. Creak! The darkness behind it was too deep, unnatural, swallowing up all the light. Peppa instinctively stepped back. Then it appeared. Out of the blackness, a hoof slid into view. It looked like hers, but too long, with thin fingers instead of rounded edges. Then a second hoof emerged, and then a face peeked out. It was exactly like Peppa's, but its eyes were pitch black, empty, and its mouth— the mouth slowly stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Peppa screamed and grabbed George's hoof. She bolted toward the hallway door. But then the light flickered. For a split second, everything was swallowed by total darkness. And when the light returned, the door was gone. All that remained was a blank wall, as if it had never existed. George whimpered, clutching Peppa's arm. She breathed heavily, eyes fixed on the spot where the door had been. Everything looked normal. But Peppa knew one thing for certain. It was still here. Somewhere. Watching. Peppa Pig, the screen. It was a rainy evening at the Pig family home. Raindrops drummed against the windows and the wind howled through the pipes. Inside, the house was warm and cozy. Peppa and George sat on the floor playing with their toys, while Daddy Pig relaxed on the couch after a long day at work. The television flickered softly, filling the room with familiar sounds. Daddy lazily flipped through the channels, clicking the remote. But something was strange. The image on the screen trembled slightly, as if the TV couldn't focus. Sometimes the sound lagged behind, making the characters' mouths move out of sync. Daddy Pig frowned and tapped the remote against his palm. The screen flickered. At first, just a brief flash of static. Then the picture began to distort. The faces of the news anchors stretched unnaturally, their eyes turning empty, their voices muffled as if coming from deep underwater. Daddy Pig leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Suddenly, the television flared with a bright white light. A cold gust of air seemed to rush from it, and the room felt thick and heavy, as if something unseen was pulling everything toward the screen. The couch trembled slightly. Daddy Pig reached for the remote, but his fingers slipped. He tried to pull back, but something was dragging him forward. First, just a little, then with a sudden yank. Peppa and George froze, unable to move. They watched as Daddy Pig was pulled toward the screen. His feet lifted off the ground, his hands clawed at the armrests, his face twisted in terror. It all happened in seconds. The last thing they saw were his outstretched hands, disappearing into the flickering light. Then the TV glitched once more, and a dead silence filled the room. Peppa took a hesitant step forward. George clutched his dinosaur, his breathing shaky. The screen flickered again. And then, movement. A shadow shifted behind the static. A face, pale, distorted, with hollow eyes. It looked like Daddy Pig, but something was wrong. His lips trembled as if he was trying to speak. But instead of words, a low, muffled sound came through, the sound of heavy breathing. The screen flashed one last time before turning completely black. The house fell silent again. Only the rain continued to tap against the glass. Peppa slowly took a step back. The television showed nothing now, but Peppa could feel that it was still watching.